I decided to work with high impact practices for my dissertation, which I'm going to talk a little bit about what that is. But a lot of work with high impact practices is in, the results are pretty non-cognitive. So student engagement, a lot of the things that, and they're really, I mean, they have some really evidence-based outcomes for them, but they're all, most of them are based on student responses about how they felt like they were impacted by these different kinds of practices. And so I wanted to go a little bit different route and really look at what critical thinking levels, how they were impacted by high impact practices. So I am not somebody who likes to focus on student deficits when I think about students. I'm really interested in student access and the kinds of activities that we can do to make sure that all students can learn regardless of where they are. However, a big part of my dissertation was talking about student deficits because we do have to understand where our students come from before we can actually know how to intervene. And so students in the United States are coming to college lacking a lot of the basic skills that they need to be successful. It can lead to issues of retention, and it can also lead to issues of poor academic performance. Because of this, a lot of faculty members and administrators are looking for ways to engage students in learning and therefore improve their academic performance. One of the ways to do this is through high impact practices. And this graph is 5 of the 11 high impact practices that have been identified. And a little bit later, I'll have a list of all 11 of those. But I chose these 5 because these were the ones that we do pretty well here at SNU. And I knew that I was going to be using SNU students for this particular study. So undergraduate research, study abroad, which is a subset of diversity learning. Diversity learning is the larger practice, but study abroad is part of that. Capstones, internships, and learning communities. So those are the 5 that I focused on for this, for my dissertation. So one of the biggest academic disadvantages that's displayed by college students is a lack of critical thinking. You guys all may have experienced that. Critical thinking involves both analysis and problem solving. So being able to pick something apart, figure out what's going on there, and then to be able to take that next step, apply things that you've learned to problems. There are a lot of reasons that our students are not great critical thinkers. Some of that has to do with K through 12 systems and the teaching to the test kind of things that are coming through that. A lot of that is remnants of No Child Left Behind, which doesn't exist anymore, but we're still dealing with the fallout from No Child Left Behind. So as higher education people, we're not really in the business of solving the K through 12 problem, so we have to figure out how we're going to deal with this once they're in our classrooms. So this leads to the problem that I was looking at in my particular study is college faculty members value critical thinking skills, which probably all of you in here would say yes, but struggle to teach them, especially with academically disadvantaged students. There are a lot of studies that have all kinds of different ways to try and teach critical thinking, but it's one of those things that if you're not intentionally trying to teach critical thinking, it often doesn't happen. So if you're trying to teach US history, how do you also teach critical thinking? And so that's part of why we're looking for strategies that can do both. So the purpose of this particular study was to determine if participation in one of these 5 practices will affect the critical thinking levels of college students. So I'm going to go back to a little bit of the theoretical framework for my study. So the main theory that I was working with was constructivism. Constructivism is the idea that students build their knowledge based on things they have already learned or things they have already experienced. And when you're looking at high impact practices, all of them play into or are based in this theory of constructivism. So in a learning community, that's really about social learning. And so they're building their knowledge based on how they're interacting with one another and how they're interacting with the professor. An undergraduate research project builds on existing knowledge in their discipline, and then they're creating new knowledge that connects back to that. Internships and capstones require them to take what they've been learning in the classroom and apply that in a real world situation. And what was my fifth one? Cannot remember. Sorry. Study abroad. Yeah, study abroad. They're taking, to me, this is one of the most interesting ones when it comes to constructivism, because they're confronted with things that often go against what they thought they knew. So they go into a new culture and it's like all of a sudden they're like, oh, these things that I was sure of, maybe that's not necessarily. And so they're having to deal with that previous knowledge in a new way. So I had 3 research questions for my study. The first question was, how does participation in HIPs, or high impact practices, affect critical thinking overall? So any participation in any HIP, how does that actually affect critical thinking? So my second question is, can we break this up into how many HIPs the students have participated in, and will that make a change in the level of critical thinking? This particular research question came out of a study that was done in 2012 by the American Association of Colleges and Universities, where they actually took different levels of participation in HIPs and looked at how that affected deep learning and how that affected student engagement, and found that as the participation increased, the deep learning and student engagement increased, especially for those students who were at the most academic disadvantage. And my third research question was, is the change in critical thinking for advantaged students different from the change in critical thinking for disadvantaged students as a result of participating in these HIPs? And that was really the heart of what I was most interested in looking at. All right, so a little bit of background. According to the College Board, only 26% of students who took the ACT in 2016 met all 4 benchmarks for college readiness. However, 84% of those students said they wanted to go to college. So 26% are ready, 84% want to go, okay? So that can actually lead to some challenges for our students, right? Retention. The harder coursework and requirements to take remedial course can lead to academic frustration and the inclination to drop out of college. This is especially true for first-generation college students whose families don't know how to support them, low-income students who often must struggle working in coursework, and minority students who are often both first-generation and low-income. Keels found that Black and Latino students have a lower graduation rate than their white and Asian peers, while Arnold, Liu, and Armstrong found that college completion rates between rich and poor students is widening. So we not only have first-generation status and ethnicity issues, we also have class issues that are playing into how students are able to actually finish college. There's also social challenges, and I think sometimes we forget about this. We look, as professors, we sort of look at that academic piece and don't necessarily think about some of the social challenges that students have. Joyce Meaning and Darnan found that university culture seems to favor white, middle-class, continuing generation students over students who are first generation, low income, and minority. This can lead to feelings of disengagement and withdrawal from the social life of the university. Not only do they have to figure out how to navigate academic culture, they have to figure out how to navigate middle-class culture, which a lot of them are not necessarily ready to be doing. So related to both of those challenges are the academic challenges that are faced by these students. A lot of it relates back to their high school preparation. Students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds tend to go to high schools that aren't as efficient at preparing them for college. And this is especially true for Black and Latino students in the United States. They also have a really hard time with higher levels of reading and math. I'm sure you probably have heard lots of stories from your wife about this, because she teaches at one of these schools that struggles. And again, one of the things that I want to hear is, that I want you to hear is, nobody blames those teachers, right? It's a system that is broken. As I mentioned already, critical thinking ability is an important aspect of the college experience and is often lacking in academically disadvantaged students. There's differing definitions of what critical thinking actually is. In 1990, a kind of landmark report was put out called the Delphi Report, and they defined critical thinking as the ability to analyze, interpret, evaluate, and draw conclusions about new knowledge. Recent researchers, though, have argued while that's true, it also involves the process and attitude of learning. So it's also a little bit of some non-cognitive things that are playing into that role. Despite the differing definitions, most educators agree that critical thinking requires a deeper understanding of application analysis and inference than just mere rote learning of material. So when it comes to teaching critical thinking, we have a lot of challenges. There's disagreement among both researchers and practitioners about the best ways to actually teach critical thinking. So what things actually encourage it? And when we find those things, who's helping our faculty to develop that? So there's also this lack of professional development, especially with faculty, to help them know how to develop critical thinking. That means that many college courses still rely on rote memorization and surface learning activities rather than including activities like metacognition, problem solving, and reflection. This is especially troubling in light of Rickles and colleagues finding that lack of critical thinking instruction in college students can actually lead to a decrease in critical thinking skills. So students may come in as freshmen at a particular kind of critical thinking level, but if that's not fostered by the time they're seniors, their critical thinking levels can go down. So research has suggested that there are a variety of ways that critical thinking can be developed. Lowe, Saltery, and Pascarella found that students were able to think more critically when their teachers were organized. This is especially, right, I know. It's especially true for academically disadvantaged students. Time also seems to play a factor in critical thinking development with longer critical thinking instruction. So if we're thinking about teaching critical thinking over an entire semester, rather than just doing like a 3-week section on critical thinking, that entire semester tends to work a little bit better. So high impact practices is, as a practitioner and as a researcher, what I am really, really interested in. And so it's really the focus of my project. So a little bit about high impact practices. In 2008, George Koo and other people at the American Association of Colleges and Universities published kind of the definitive paper on high impact practices. They've been around for a long time. People have been doing them for a long time, but this was the first time that researchers really came together and said, let's look at these as a whole and let's examine how they work and how they work with one another and who benefits from them. And this particular paper was actually talking about how the students who most benefit are the ones who are most disadvantaged. So the 5 that I looked at, I'm going to really go into detail here, and then I'll also just give a brief overview of the other 6. So learning communities, we know what those are because we do them here at SMU. This HIP can take many forms, but usually involves a group of students who are placed in linked courses with shared learning experiences. Sometimes the courses can be within a major. Sometimes they're interdisciplinary. Ours tend to be interdisciplinary here. Learning communities can also incorporate shared living experiences as well. So I know at the University of North Texas, all of their music students live in one dorm, and they all take paired courses as freshmen. And at a school that has 30,000 undergraduates and graduates, 30,000 students, that's a really good way for them to build that cohort in for their majors. The shared learning experiences lead to higher retention rates, higher GPAs, and higher academic standing. In addition, learning communities can also help offset those social challenges that we have a lot of students facing, because they're automatically placed into a smaller group within the larger group that they have connections to. I will say that one of the things that I've noticed here, and that this is not necessarily criticism, I think this is something that we need to begin looking at, though, is that learning communities really benefit from intentionality. And I think sometimes we just throw a couple courses together and we're not necessarily super intentional about those paired assignments, about those ways in which the courses overlap, and that in many ways can diminish the effectiveness of the learning community. So I'm actually doing a study this semester looking at the academic performance of students that are in learning communities and those who are taking the same courses not in learning community, to see where we might want to tweak a little bit, and because if they're done well, the students in the learning community should be performing better academically than those that are not in the learning community, on the whole. Obviously not individually, but on the whole. So secondly, undergraduate research. This HIP allows an undergraduate student to undertake his or her own research project under the guidance of a faculty mentor. Like the other ones, this shows improvement in GPA and improvement in retention. However, the unique mentoring relationship included in undergraduate research helps students develop an academic identity. And it also increases a sense of academic belonging, which is a major, major issue for disadvantaged students. They don't feel like they belong to the academy. But when they are producing their own research, working one-on-one with faculty, it helps them understand themselves as a scholar in the discipline. It's especially beneficial for academically disadvantaged students, which is why I think the McNair program on a national level pushes this so hard. It's also been very beneficial for developing critical thinking skills. Because if you think about what are they doing, they're analyzing a problem, they're figuring out how to solve that problem over and over. And so this is a really, really good one for critical thinking. Diversity global learning is when students are encouraged to interact with people who are different from them. So that's racial differences, ethnic differences, gender differences, however students can figure out how they're different. It encourages them to call those differences what they are and to learn how to address those differences in community. It also encourages them to reflect on issues of racism, bigotry, sexism, all of those kinds of exclusionary ways that we define people. Diversity learning is one way that really helps students to look that in the face and to address it. And again, if it's a well-designed experience, students come out of that with much better understanding of who they are, their place in the world. Diversity learning is especially helpful for white males in the United States. They tend to be the least let me say, cognizant of the differences in our society. Study abroad experiences also help students to increase cultural competency, respect for diversity, self-confidence, and independence. They also have academic benefits, linguistic competency, awareness of global issues, and application of knowledge to new situations. Even things like reading a map. When you study abroad, you got to figure out, like, how do I get around in this country where I don't necessarily know how their road signs work? I don't know how their public transportation works. Things as basic as that are skills that a lot of our students don't have. And so doing a study abroad experience is really good for them. The effect of diversity learning on critical thinking is mixed, with some studies finding an increase in critical thinking and some finding a decrease in critical thinking. One of the studies that found a decrease in critical thinking proposed, and I think this is an interesting hypothesis, that maybe the reason, so all of these studies typically are asking students to assess their own critical thinking. And so a lot of, do you feel like you're a better critical thinker as a result of this? And, they're not measured objectively. And a lot of the students, when they're coming back from a study abroad experience, their minds have been opened so much to new experiences, and they've started to sort of have a little bit of doubt in who they are as a global citizen. Like everything that they thought they knew has been challenged. So when they come back and they're asked, are you a better critical thinker? They're now comparing themselves to a much broader audience than just their tiny little world. And so it could be that they are increasing in critical thinking, but their own awareness now of a bigger world has made them think they're less of a critical thinker. And that's where I think something like what I used in my study, the Watson-Glaser critical thinking assessment, that is an objective measure, would be better for looking at that than having the students report on it themselves. Internships. Internships are where students work with professionals in their field of study to gain experience applying classroom knowledge to real-world situations. Most research on the effectiveness of internships has revolved around the social and career benefits of the experiences, although some academic benefits have been found as well. Students participating in internships often show an increase in their motivation to learn. So they go out to, wherever it is they're doing their internship, and they realize, I learned a lot in the classroom, but I didn't learn enough. And so they're more motivated to want to learn more so that they can keep up with what's happening and so that they can feel competent in their discipline. They often have higher course grades after doing an internship because they've actually seen the real world application of what they're learning in the classroom. So that's a really, really good benefit of the internship.
And don't you think that along that lines, they probably know what questions to ask? Sometimes when you're learning something new, you don't know what you don't know. So when they've been out there in the world, they go, oh, I need to find this out. Right. Whereas a lot of people that don't have that benefit, they learn after, and then they've got to try to scramble.
Right.
So I think maybe that too.
Curiosity.
I think, and that's why I think they're so beneficial to do while you're still in school, so that you have those resources of your professors, and more coursework. Absolutely, The final practice that I explored in my study was the capstone experience, which is typically undertaken in a student's final semester or final year. They take many, many forms. There was one study that I read in Australia. Everybody was required to do a capstone, but every experience was different because it was really dependent on their discipline. But they usually require students to reflect on their learning over the course of their college career and ask them to create some sort of paper or project which demonstrates their competency. So there's a reflective piece and there's a competency piece. And to me, the best thing about the capstone is that metacognitive reflection piece, where they say, okay, these are the experiences that helped me to think like a biologist, like a historian, like a musician, whatever that was. Sorry. One of the stated goals of most capstone experiences is critical thinking. However, the research is kind of mixed about that. Sometimes it does develop critical thinking and sometimes it doesn't. I think the big piece there is how good is the reflective piece. So if they're actually really engaging in deep reflection, I think that's going to really help develop that critical thinking. But if it's more just like a, what did you learn kind of, tell us all the facts, that probably is not as good at developing that deep critical thinking. A 2013 publication by the American Association of Colleges and Universities provided evidence that while participation in individual HIPs is beneficial for students, participation in multiple HIPs may be even more effective, especially for academically disadvantaged students. So combining the HIPs into one experience can also lead to greater academic benefits. For example, learning communities combined with first-year experiences, which is kind of what we do here. I think we could bump up our first-year experience just a little bit more, but that's kind of what we do. All the students come in, they do NSI together, and then they continue on through, and then we still meet, you know, all year. So there is a little bit of that component. First year seminars combined with undergraduate research resulted in higher academic performance for a group of academically disadvantaged students. This particular study was so interesting. They took the sort of what we would call our tier 5 students, the ones that we just sort of expect to drop out, right? Because we're just taking them, we're taking a big risk on them. They put them into a learning community that had an embedded undergraduate research project in it. It was all year, and they did like 6 weeks study skills, 6 weeks they started their research project, then back to the 6 weeks of study skills. They did one research project, and it was for the institution. So it was some kind of, something that the institution wanted to find out about. I think it was a student development project. And so they had survey data that they were working with, but they all worked together. And then they all did this big presentation at the end of the year. And faculty came, asked the students questions, the students knew the answer. They had a 95% retention rate for those students. Wow. So that is pretty impressive.
That year or through completion?
Through
graduation?
Through that year, from first to second year. Yeah.
But I'll bet you the statistics say they stayed.
I bet they did too. Yeah. Because if they can, because they got connected. What one of the students said was, this was the first time that anybody ever thought I knew something.
Right.
Yeah. So those, combining these things together is even more impactful. All right, so for the sake of this workshop, I wanted to also just very quickly go through the other 6 high impact practices. Common intellectual experiences is when students experience something. It's more than a learning community. It's more like, we're going to tackle maybe racism at SMU. And we're going to, as a class, we're going to do some research. We're going to actually walk through this intellectual experience together. Or for like my New York trip that I do in the spring, that's a common intellectual experience. We're all going to New York together. We're all visiting these museums together. We're all having these academic conversations together. So it's more than just a learning community. Collaborative learning, this one's pretty self-explanatory. It's, you know, the team-based learning, working in groups. That is another high-impact practice. And this is one that's super easy to embed into our courses, right? With intentionality. They all have to be done, not just for the sake of doing group work, but to actually foster deep learning. Service learning is another one that some of our departments do really well. Gina Weaver gave a great talk on how she's incorporated service learning into her honors class. This is where students find something in the community and then work with that organization to actually impact the community in a larger way. First year experiences, the way that we do it here is pretty first year experience light. A lot of first year experiences involve study skills, how to adjust to college, those kinds of things that maybe students don't come in knowing. The research is very mixed on first year experiences because some of them just don't work at all and students hate them. Other times they're really well designed. And it's really difficult to take a first year experience that works down the street and just translate that to your context, because we all have very different cultures on our campuses, very different students. And so this was one that I feel like is very difficult to really do well, but if you can do it well, it's very, very beneficial. Writing intensive courses, again, with intentionality, not just because you want your students to write a bunch of stuff, but all different, so reflective writing, investigative writing, all of the different kinds of ways that we write embedded into whatever course that you have. That's really good for critical thinking. And then the 11th one is brand new. This was identified by the AAC&U probably about 2 years ago. E-portfolios serve a lot of the same purpose as a capstone. So an e-portfolio is where students throughout the course of maybe through their major or even maybe through a gen ed program, they are uploading their own work to a centralized electronic portfolio. And then that is used to assess their progress throughout their time in whatever it is in their major or whatever. The key thing, again, for e-portfolios, though, is reflection. So let me upload this paper that I did for Modern World. What did that teach me about the modern world? You know, so there has to be these kinds of reflective pieces that go along with that. Then when we take our upper division, global learning, how is that different from what I learned in Modern World? How did Modern World prepare me for that? You know, those kinds of things. And all of that is there. And then what do you have? You have this beautiful portfolio of your work to say, oh, and job, oh, and graduate school. Here's an e-portfolio of what I did in undergraduate. The Tia Brown McNair, who is actually coming to speak, yay, in January at our faculty meeting, she wrote a book called Becoming a Student Ready College. I just love her. She works at the American Association of Colleges and Universities. When she was talking about this at a conference that I was at, she was saying that when she looks for people now, she expects them to have an e-portfolio that they can share with her that shows the quality of their work and what they've been doing. And so I think that more and more we're going to move to where high-end employers and graduate schools are looking to say, what do you have that can show us what you can do? So less.
And it's so much easier electronically than having to send, you know, a big binder of multiple years of college to see like the education department used to have those big binders of all their work. Now I think it's so easy for employers to ask for something like that, and they get a feel for how you will do.
Whereas, a lot more about you than just a grade.
You
got an A in this class, but what did you do in this class?
So should we be encouraging our students to file and keep copies of major work they do?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think we should. And my hope is, I know that with the McNair grant, one of the things that we embedded into that would be for a lot of our STEM majors to start doing e-portfolios, and for McNair students, when they graduate from here, they're going to have e-portfolios. I can do that because, you know, it's a controlled environment. I can charge that. But one of the things that Dennis and I have talked about, and Dr. Hackler and I have talked about, is, you know, maybe working on a pilot grant or something like that, where we would do that for other majors on campus and really help encourage that. Because again, it's a training thing. I think that every faculty member would be interested in learning how to do this, but who has the time? Or, you know, if we had an e-portfolio program that we could use that everybody was, you know, had access to, and there are plenty out there, but how would we want to use that, and what would we collect? I think it'd be great for our gen ed program, you know, because that's one of the things that is distinctive about us is, you know, that you have a business major, but they've taken an art class. They've taken, you know, so they can show sort of the variety of knowledge that they have outside of just their major.
Well, and a lot of the PGS programs do that. And they use Google Sites. I mean, you know, so you can use with some of the tools you have. Like if you had a student that wanted to start one, they could definitely just do it like that. I mean, there's fancier, slicker out there, but
Google Site's free, and
it's easy to share with anybody that, you know. So I don't know, if you have students that you think might benefit from that, they all have access to do it like that. I
think there's some really, really good potential with this. And to me, I actually think e-portfolio is kind of like the crowning achievement of all high impact practices, because if you do these other 10, you upload all of those to your portfolio, to the e-portfolio, right? So
It's kind of funny. Just the other day, I was going through a bunch of old files, and I came across some papers and stuff that I did when I was working on my master's program. And they're all in this file. I said, well, these are kind of neat, but this was before computer. These were hand typed, carbon copy.
Well, you know, I don't know what's worse. Mine are on a zip disk. Do y'all ever remember those?
Oh,
You young whippersnappers don't know what a zip disk is, but it's like lots of floppy disks in one big one. So it was like the next CD. It was between floppy disks and CDs. And now I have no way to read those.
I have mine printed out, but I mean, what am I going to do with this? And, you know, I read them and I'm like, do I still understand that?
Floppy disk.
Pull that back from the little desk.
All right. So, a little bit about my particular study. My research method was a one-group quasi-experimental quantitative study. And I used a pre-test, post-test design. My sample was undergraduate students here, small Midwestern University. Here's the ethnic background of the sample that I used. It's actually more diverse, I think, than sometimes we get at SMU.
I was gonna say, really?
Yeah. Partly because I used a lot of McNair students for the pre-test data. And then I also targeted students that were in like critical thinking strategies and modern English usage, as well as some of our honors students. Here's the breakdown of the incoming ACT. And so I don't know if I can hide this so you can see the, yeah, I can't really hide it, but
You should just be able to press
Yeah,
hide.
oh, there it is. I
Yeah.
couldn't see the,
Yeah, it's really small.
yeah.
There you go.
Oh, there we go, yeah. So you can see the ethnic breakdown there of the incoming ACTs of the students that were in my particular sample. 26% were first-generation college students, 36% were Pell eligible. This was a convenient sample, so what I did was McNair was doing a long-term study on critical thinking as part of the old curriculum. And so each semester I would give the Watson Glaser to the brand new students in McNair, and then I would try and pull in some other students. So sometimes live students, sometimes, you know, whoever I could get that would like send their students over or let me come to class, and, you know, so very much a convenient sample. My sample size at the end, though, was only 19. And here's what happened. So I had 95 data records from who had taken the Watson Glaser. Then when I actually went through to determine who was still at SMU, because some of these were, you know, the ones that are at high risk of dropping out, we were down to like 50 some. And then by the time I got through all of the IRBs that I had to get through, I ended up having to collect data the last 2 weeks of the spring semester. And so the IRB at my school was very particular that it had to happen like in a testing center where nobody could see anybody else and all of that. And so trying to set up times with students during that time, it was nearly impossible. And I couldn't just pull in anybody because I needed that pre-test data that I had used before. So I ended up with only 19. So I'll talk a little bit later about what I hope to do with this later, because I mean, you know, you do what you do, right?
Yeah.
So as I said, I had existing Watson Glaser critical thinking assessment institutional data. And then I used existing institutional demographic data. So I had already collected all that demographic data when I had originally done the Watson Glaser, and so I already had all of that, ethnicity and Pell eligibility and all of that. Then I developed a high impact practices survey, which was basically, did you participate? Yes. How many times? You know, so I just had the 5 that I was focusing on. And then I used the Watson Glaser for the post-test. The Watson Glaser is, I may actually have something in here. Maybe not. So the Watson Glaser is a 40-minute pencil and paper test. It's 80 questions. There are 5 sections that look at 5 different domains of critical thinking. All right, so a few limitations. No randomness at all. I didn't have a control group or anything like that. I was really it's just a one, you know, pre-test, post-test kind of thing. And then there was also differences in time between pre-test and post-test. So I had some students who had taken the Watson Glaser as a freshman, and then they took the post-test, they were seniors. Mm-hmm. Then I also had some that had taken it first semester freshman year and took the post-test second semester freshman year. I wasn't super worried about that because most of the literature says college itself does not actually increase critical thinking. It's those intentional kinds of activities that increase critical thinking. And so my thought was some of those intentional activities are what I'm looking at, those high impact practices. And so I wasn't super worried about that. But that is something I think in the future I might want to only choose students that had the exact amount of time between pre-test, post-test. I purposely only did 5 high impact practices, one just for ease of data analysis and all of that, but also because those are really the 5 that I felt like most students would have participated in at least one of those at SMU. And then there are some differences. I decided not to say, okay, I'm just going to look at first generation, or I'm just going to look at ethnicity, or I'm just going to look at Pell eligibility. I just put all of those. If you had one of those academic disadvantage markers, then you got put into the academic disadvantaged group. So my findings. My first question was, does participation in HIPS increase critical thinking? And my answer was yes. It did significantly predict between pre-test and post-test that participation in any of them did increase critical thinking overall for all the students that took the Watson-Glaser. This was a paired sample t-test. My second hypothesis was each one of these, so I broke them up. We didn't have any students that had not participated in any, because every student at SMU has been doing a learning community for the last several years, and so they all could say at least one HIP. And then they had identified 2 to 5 or 6, or I figured that out unless they told me how many that they had participated in, and so I broke them up that way. What I found is that there was not a significant difference between participation in each of these groups and the post-test score of critical thinking. Remember, I only had a sample of 19. But here's what's interesting. If you look at the actual mean critical thinking score, you can see it does go up with participation in each one of those by about 2 points. Even though those differences are not significant, they are significant for those 5 that participated in 2 to 5, you know, their scores did go up. And there were some students whose scores went up by about 13 points. And those were some of the most disadvantaged students. So even though there weren't significant differences, to me this still says something about that participation in more HIPs creating a better outcome for students. So my last one, were disadvantaged students different from advantaged students? And not significantly, but again, look at this. The advantaged students, their mean change in score was 1. Disadvantaged, their mean change in score was 5. So even though that wasn't a significant difference, if my critical thinking went up by 5, I think I'd be pretty happy, right? And so it really does show this, how HIPS, even though, I mean, the advantaged students still helped them, but it really, really helps those disadvantaged students. It really helps to close that gap. And when you looked at, what I don't have up here is the actual mean score, I just have the change, but it does close that gap too. So yeah, the disadvantaged students did get closer to the mean critical score of the advantaged students. They didn't catch up, but they got closer. So what does it mean, right? So we do indeed, as a result of the study, we're able to say they do positively affect critical thinking development. Even with such a small sample, we were able to say that. Further research is required for the effects of multiple HIPs. There are a lot of studies that are showing multiple HIPs do actually help students. Again, they're not necessarily looking at objective data like I was looking at, actual change in scores. And so I think we need to do further research. I'd also like to look at change in GPA, because GPA is about persistence, right? Mm-hmm. So our GPA is going up as they're becoming more and more embedded in these kinds of activities that promote deep learning.
Which also those scores might, you know, you're talking about the difference of time.
Right.
That would be interesting to look at.
Yeah, yeah. And then, of course, further research is required to determine the effects of HIPs for academically disadvantaged students. And again, I think that we'll continue to find evidence that these disadvantaged students do really benefit from these. So my recommendations, using HIPs as part of the curriculum can increase critical thinking. So in practice, there are ways I think that we can start to embed these little things, so you can't do a huge research project. Have the students develop a hypothesis, have them do a little bit of a lit review. That is undergraduate research, even if they haven't completed an entire paper or project on their own. They're having to do inquiry. And that's part of developing critical thinking. And of course, writing intensive stuff and group work, all those things can easily be embedded into curriculum. And then encouraging academically disadvantaged students to participate in HIPs. One of the problems that we see is that, say a faculty member wants to, I mean, even on this campus, and this is certainly no slam against Gina, but she's developed this beautiful HIPs integrated course that honor students have access to. And I mean, I'm glad honor students have access to it, and I wouldn't in any way ever want that not to happen. But wouldn't it be great if we had more opportunities like that maybe focus specifically on the students that are taking critical thinking strategies, the students that are in modern English usage, maybe develop a course that would embed a lot of these kinds of practices where the most needy students are. It'd be interesting to see how that turns out. And then for research, I think I've already said some of this. I'd be interested in investigating individual academic disadvantage markers. So do first generation students benefit differently from low income students or from students from ethnic minorities? Because there are some students who might be from, might be African American, but they're not first generation, they're not low income. Would they have a different kind of engagement with these than maybe a student that was white who was poor, I think that'd be kind of interesting. I also think doing a longitudinal study. So let's look at over 5 years, what is the effect of constant participation in these kinds of activities for our students? And then varying the combination of HIPs. So we, try learning communities and first year experiences, and then next time we try first year experiences in undergraduate research, or, whatever that is, to see maybe if there are certain combinations that work better than others. I think trying to create a course that has all 11 and doing them effectively is impossible.
Make your head spin.
Yeah, but maybe looking at, departments sitting down and looking at, okay, our students have to have these, 2 years of courses. What can we embed in here in that experience that can provide the most opportunity for them to have access to these practices?
Right.
And then investigating the effects of, so this is kind of the opposite, looking at combinations, but then also maybe looking at individual HIPs. Are some just better with our students? Because again, it's our context, right? So we are a very white campus. So maybe diversity learning experiences might be more beneficial to our students than students at a campus that is a little bit more diverse. I don't know. So I think those kinds of things might be interesting to look at in our particular context. So this study is just the first step in determining the effect of high impact practices on student learning. And I already said I have lots of ideas for expanding this research, getting bigger sample size, and doing maybe something that's publishable. A lot of the research that's being done on HIPs is about retention. It's about student engagement. It's about those kinds of things that maybe administrators are looking for, but not necessarily faculty are looking for. And so I really like to do more research focused primarily on academic performance as a result of HIPs. So that critical thinking aspect, that GPA attainment, although GPA is not everything, but even just how are they doing on tests? If you have this class here that's doing that, and you have another class over here that's not, comparing those and saying, are they even just doing better on the individual tests or individual assignments? Are their reflections better because they're actually being taught how to reflect, those kinds of things. Overall, it's all about student engagement and learning, right? That's what we want. And these kinds of things are another way to do that. They're not the only way. I think they're a pretty good way. So that is it. Questions?
Well, I think some of those further research might, I don't know if sell is the right word, but when Gina did her presentation, she mentioned the time it took as the instructor to coordinate, and so I can see a lot of people saying, well, I don't have time to grade that, but maybe if they knew, like if you had something to back that up that showed, that you're your student learning, your student outcomes, the assessment pieces are gonna
Right.
out so much. I mean, maybe that would help.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, evidence-based practice is it's usually easier to sell.
Than just here's
Right.
here's what we want you to do.
Right, exactly. Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. Yeah. Anything else?
I'm just curious as to what capstones we do here. I don't know enough.
Yeah, we do. I know music business does one. Yeah. How do you know that?
So
And
each major has
yes,
a course or a project at the end of it.
Depends on the major. I think that I think almost all of our majors have either an internship or a capstone that are part of it. Again, I don't know how much intentionality is put into them and that reflective piece. And actually, Ken and I were talking about the other day because he does a pretty good capstone experience, but there's not a reflection piece. And he said, after having listened to me for like last 4 years, he's like, maybe that's a piece that I should consider including because that's helpful to him as well.
Right.
What were the experiences that helped make me really good at what I do?
Course evaluation or a program evaluation.
Right, absolutely. And that's a really good point too, is this kind of stuff, if you're doing this, how easy would that be to roll right into program review? These are the things we're doing to engage students beyond just the regular classroom teaching. Yeah.
This isn't necessarily like a question, but I guess more along the lines of a statement. So when we have like, I know I feel like I read something recently where it said that African American women are like one of the most like highly educated like groups of people in the United States. So if we're looking at African Americans who are in college, if we're looking at statistics, more than likely the father is not in the home. So we have we don't have a first generation student that's here. We have one though who might be academic, who might be like financially disadvantaged. So when we think about the opportunity for them to be able to study abroad,
right?
Especially if they're like maybe the oldest or second or third or wherever they fall in the lineup of like how many children are in that home, like what can we do or what are we doing to address we know that this is going to be really, really great for you, but we know you can't afford it.
Right. Yeah, and that's a really good question. There are some foundations that are actually looking at that kind of thing, and they're like one of the University of California, San Diego actually has an entire undergraduate research experience that they target lower income students and they take them to Japan. And so they do this whole like research project ahead of time, and they go to Japan and they actually investigate it. They've got things set up. And so I think it's one of those things where we would have to, as an institution, decide this is an important enough practice for us, and there are enough benefits that we're going to go ahead and put some, money behind it. But I think that's a very good point because study abroad is expensive. The great thing about that, though, is that it's not just study abroad that diversity learning contains, and there are many other ways that students can engage in these cross-cultural kinds of experiences, learn a lot of the same things without necessarily having to fork out a bunch of money to go, study abroad.
So do you think one of the ways to be able to kind of, cut down financially, like, other than like living in a foreign country would be maybe like partnerships with other universities, maybe on the other side of the United States or something? Or rural
or
versus,
even
like,
just, I was going to say, think about the difference between Stillwater and Oklahoma City. There's a great deal of cultural difference between those two cities. So even something like that where, the thing is again, it's going to have to be intentional. What are the questions that you're asking? What are the issues that you're asking students to actually face and talk about? I was talking with my students the other day about race issues in art, and they didn't talk. And they're like, it's just too uncomfortable to talk about this. I'm like, yes, yes, it is, And so I think those are things that even we as faculty, even though my class is not specifically geared towards diversity learning, when we have those opportunities to ask those questions and continue, understanding what that means. And maybe some of it's just training, faculty development.